we've been rolling through this spring giving campaign. So over the last 3 weeks, we've talked about our financial need, a moment in time where we are right now that we really want to call the community to awareness and in any way possible to contribute above and beyond what you typically would give at Cedar Ridge financially. There are a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into those reasons now, but if you're sticking around for the after-service strategic forum, you could always come up to me. I'll be at one of the tables in this room, and you can ask me specific questions about the budget, about expenses, income, etc. I'm not going to go into that at this moment, but we are about halfway through the giving campaign that will end on June 11. So today being May 21st, we're about halfway through the campaign. So far, our totals of giving have been just under $43,000 for those first 3 weeks of the campaign. Our goal, anybody remember the goal for the campaign? Oh, I know, you're so excited. Right? $150,000 is the giving campaign goal, and we hope to get to that goal by June 11. That's a very challenging goal. It's very ambitious. But just to take one more minute of your time this morning, I want us to remember that this community responds to these kinds of challenges. And it's not just because we are such good people, I think that's true, but it's because I think a lot of us practice our faith in a really miraculous, amazing way. In fact, 2015, a little bit less than 2 years ago, we had a similar challenge. It was a little bit larger number, $200,000, and we had 2 months of time to try to reach that goal. This community did reach that goal back in 2015. And to help the community sort of focus in on that campaign, we asked a bunch of people from the community to share personally why they give to Cedar Ridge, what it is about our community that is so important to them that they want to support financially this community. We created some videos, we showed those videos back in 2015. We thought it would be a good time today, right now, to go back and look at some of those. We're not gonna have time for all of that, but we've kind of remixed that video and we're gonna show that right now. Hopefully you could either see somebody you know up there, or you might actually see yourself up in this video. So just here's a minute to watch this video.
Giving is an act of faith. It is very much a reflection that you have faith in God, that He will provide for you.
Realistically, deep down inside of myself, I know that I already have so much. And just choosing to live just a little bit more simply so that I can give a bit more generously, I know that that's a pretty healthy thing for me to do.
I think we've always been really impressed from the first time we came here with the thoughtfulness of how this church operates, just down from the vision to, and then the way that that vision is accomplished through mission work, through the farm, through everything else going on here. It's just a great place that we can give our money to make sure that it operates and can keep doing more.
I have found that I can never outgive God. And I don't mean that in a transactional sense, like I give money and therefore I get something, but I get so much from here and from being a part of this community. And I really do want the community to have the resources to keep on doing what it's doing and to engage other people and challenge and be God's presence in the world. And I view the contributions that we make as a small part of keeping that going. I
believe in what Cedar Ridge does and what we stand for, and I want to be a part of that. And for me, that means giving financially and giving in other ways too.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Melinda Anderson. I'm chair of the Board of Trustees here at Cedar Ridge. And you just listened to really thoughtful and compelling reasons for why people give to Cedar Ridge. And I'm sure, if polled, many of you would agree with one or all of the reasons for why you give to this amazing community. But what about those who don't give? What about those who give sporadically? And what about those who give less than they could? In a 2015 survey of our community, we asked all of you to describe Cedar Ridge. This is what you said: accepting, open, genuine, welcoming, caring, real. We all love Cedar Ridge, for the reasons on the screen. But to what degree are we willing to sacrifice to preserve what's on the screen? Cedar Ridge, I have some hard questions for you this morning. Are we prepared to move from a culture of consumerism, enjoying all that Cedar Ridge has to offer, to a culture of sustainability, truly investing in Cedar Ridge's work and its ministries, including the ministering of this community? As always, I'm asking you to give generously. I'm sure you recall me and Steve and others standing up here many times asking you to give generously, to dig deep and give sacrificially. But I also need you this morning to understand the full scope of our shortfall and the consequences if our giving does not increase. A church that has rented our facility for many years and whose rental income we have come to rely on is leaving at the end of this month, now that they've built their own church. We on the board have been working diligently to find new renters, but this transition in our rental income leaves a huge void. Like all of you who run households, when the cash is low and the bills keep coming, something has to give. Unless we can bring in more income and bring our donations up through this current giving campaign and hit our goal of $150,000 by June 11, the consequences facing this community and the serious choices facing the board are stark and difficult. We will run afoul of the covenants and clauses in our banknote that require us to maintain a minimum level of cash on hand. This can put us in a precarious position with our mortgage lender. We will be forced to cut back on our church's work and ministry. To be explicit, Guatemala, the farm, children and youth ministries, and other work that has come to define who we are as a community will all be in jeopardy. We will have to deplete some or all of our buffer. This is the reserve fund that the board has responsibly and diligently built up over the years. Digging into the buffer to keep our bills paid is simply not viable, and it will not keep our church afloat for long. We will have to look closely at our personnel expenses, one of the larger line items in the budget. And the board will have to make some really tough decisions about staffing in line with the diminished income. Cedar Ridge, I can't stand here this morning as chair of the board to deliver the traditional financial pitch, because that wouldn't be genuine and that wouldn't be real. The current giving campaign is not the status quo, because we're facing some really difficult challenges if our giving does not increase. Challenges that will significantly affect the look and the feel of this community. I love this community, and I believe in Cedar Ridge's vision, and I know in my heart that you do as well. But love is a noun and a verb. Financially supporting Cedar Ridge is love in action. I ask you to give as an act of love and commitment to this community and the vitally important work we do locally and globally. Thank you. If you could now silence your devices and join me in this responsive prayer. Good morning, God. We welcome you into our hearts and thank you for this safe space where we can quiet our busy minds and focus on you. Lord, we know we don't always put you first. We forget that in you, we live and move and have our being. In your great mercy and compassion, you never give up on us. Nothing we do can separate our hearts from your love. Your love is amazing. May we seek your face above everything else. May we seek the divine in every moment. Amen.
Thanks so much, Melinda. Let's give Melinda a round of applause, okay? Because for two reasons. One, Melinda leads the board. The board do a phenomenal job and taking care of business, and that's why she was communicating with you this morning. And I think also just to challenge people you love, and you know, that's what Melinda shared there was in love. That's a really courageous thing, right? And so thank you, Melinda. Thank you for being so honest with us and so real with us. Again, welcome everybody. My name's Matthew. I'm the lead pastor here. So I'm going to be talking for the next few minutes. We are in a series which ends today, actually. It's called The Best Is Yet to Come. And it's a series where we've been looking at different stories about Jesus that illustrate 4 themes that we have chosen, or forms that have kind of developed as we've been going through a strategic planning process, which we've been talking about over the last few weeks, and for which we have an opportunity for feedback, culminating in this forum that we're going to hold today right after the service. So I just wanted to mention about that. Throughout the series, we have these 4 themes, and there's been an opportunity to give feedback as we've gone along. Some of you have done that, and thank you so much for doing that. But what's going to happen after the service today is that you'll have an opportunity to give feedback around 10 areas of our church. We'll have them sort of spread out around. So it's a different kind of feedback. And we just want to encourage everybody to stay behind. We're going to have a little bit of lunch together. There's some of you have brought some desserts, which we'll have at the end, but we're going to start off with some light lunch. Doesn't matter whether you've brought something or not. Please feel free to stay behind and interact and give us some feedback. It's all ages are involved. Okay, so we're going to have kids in here. We're going to have feedback from kids as well, and from those of us who are a bit older too. But we have sort of preschool age childcare if you'd like to take advantage of that. That will be in the nursery area over here. So, we're going to take care of everybody. Please stay behind. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. Just a quick reminder of the themes that we've been going through. So today, as I mentioned, is the last one. We've been talking about sharing our vision with others, advancing social justice, prioritizing relationships. We talked about that last week. And then today we're going to talk about cultivate openness to God's presence. So all 4 of these, I think I've said this before. Just imagine if we could do these things, if we could grow in these things, if these could become more productive in our lives and in our community, what an incredible thing that would be. And none of them are particularly new. I don't think any of them are particularly shocking. But if we were to do them, if we were to embody them, if we were to live them out, what an amazing thing that would be. We've, as I mentioned, been having feedback as we go along. I think we have a sample of some of the feedback we've had from last week, which was about relationships. Here's some samples. I really want to have deep relationships, not just to be busy making small talk with a lot of people. That's exhausting, right? Relationships need to develop organically around some kind of commonality. We have to take the time to find out what we have in common. Here's another one. Cedar Ridge can help kids get to know one another better by letting us talk, play, and eat together. Or go on a camping trip. That's like camping wouldn't be quite like that. Okay, I love the idea that we should allow ourselves to be less efficient in order to foster relationships along the way. That's so countercultural. Sometimes I don't open up as much as I should. It's a risk. I don't really have any true, deep friendships, people I trust to share everything with. So there's some sort of confession, some honesty there, which is really cool, and expressing a need. So thank you so much for the interaction. Thank you so much for the feedback. Keep it coming in. And then, as I say, it sort of culminates today in this opportunity for everyone to give feedback around pretty much every area of our church, honestly. So please do stay behind. Okay, so I mentioned today that we're wrapping it up, and we're going to talk about this theme, cultivate openness to God. So how do we cultivate openness to God? And we're going to look at a Jesus story, as we have done over the last few weeks. And before we get into it, I wanted to say, we're not really today, and this story, I don't think, doesn't illustrate how we do that, okay? Let's say that as we move into the future and as we think about planning, we're going to get a lot more into how do we cultivate openness to God. And that's something I think it'd be fair to say we have talked about quite a lot here already. We talk about contemplation, the contemplative life, prayer practices, spiritual disciplines, things in our lives that we work at in an intentional way in order to experience more of God's presence. We've talked more recently about worship and the importance of worship and worship as a vehicle for interacting with God and experiencing our oneness with God and opening our hearts more to the divine presence. So, and by the way, in the material, we have material for this series. In the material this week, you can see some of the themes, sort of this week's theme opened up a little bit more. And a lot of the emphasis there is on prayer and worship. Okay, so in terms of how we're going to do it, it's around those subjects. But I don't really want to focus too much on that today. I guess the question I want to put out there today is why? Why would we want to try and cultivate openness to God's presence? Why is it such a big deal? Why is it important? What's compelling about it? Is it possible? Is it doable? What does it look like? Those are the kind of questions that I want us to look at a little bit, because perhaps if we could get a glimpse of what life could be like if we could cultivate more openness to God's presence. Perhaps if we could begin to believe a little bit that it's possible to experience God's presence. If we could get a taste of it, then perhaps the effort we need to put into it and the working it out, the how, etc., would be more doable. So today we're going to look a little bit more at this question of why. Why would we do this? Now, when we look at the life of Jesus, we see somebody who evidently was intimately connected to God. Right, Jesus would withdraw to pray and really kind of worked at you could tell from things he said and did that he worked at this connection to God in a very intentional kind of way. He had a rich tradition. He's constantly quoting scripture. He's very aware of his Hebrew tradition, his Jewish tradition. So he has all that kind of built in, and that's happened not accidentally. That's been very intentional on his part. So there's this kind of spiritual dimension to Jesus, which is very disciplined and very real and very intentional. But his connection to God seems to go way beyond that. Jesus connects to God in every situation. We were talking last week about the fact that Jesus was very relational. Jesus loved being around people. So Jesus is not some kind of spiritual recluse. There's nothing particularly monk-like about Jesus, right? He goes away to pray and secludes himself and spends time in solitude for sure. But most of what we read about and most of our encounter with Jesus and most of our vision of Jesus as one who's intimately connected to God is in everyday life. He seems to be able to connect to God in the normal rhythm of his life. And he kind of lives this life as though he is full of God and God is all around him, everywhere. And he sort of talks about a connection to God relationally. He calls God Father, uses that metaphor. But the way he operates is not as though he's separate from God. He operates as though God is just right there, all over the place. He sees God in other people. And delights in that. And when he moves with compassion, when he heals people, when he reaches out across barriers, he's just sort of moving in this God plane, this God dimension with great ease. And so there's something, I think, very compelling about that. How do you live that out in real life? How can we have that kind of connection, that kind of access, this free access to what Jesus has described as love, right? Because the way Jesus described God is love. That it's access to love, it's connection to love. Is that possible for us? Well, I want to look at a story this morning that there's many ways of us looking at the story and many conclusions we could draw from it, many applications. But I want to look at it particularly from the perspective of Jesus' connection to God in everyday life. So maybe we could just take a quick look at that story. It comes in John chapter 8. It's a story probably you've heard before. It's a fairly famous story about Jesus. Let's look at it and then unpack a few things from it. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, so Mount of Olives is just outside Jerusalem, right? At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, so he's back in Jerusalem, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made a stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So there's a story in which we see Jesus acting out of incredible compassion, incredible composure, and in what might, on the surface seem a very clever way. Okay, so it's an amazing story, we're just going to take a few minutes to sort of back up a little bit from it, because it's I think a story that if we have some context to it, some more context, it comes alive a little more. There are some things that become more evident about the story as we think about the context. Firstly, if you read this in most Bibles, there's a subheading. The most translations of the Bible into English break the Bible up into little subheadings to make it easier to read. And the subheading for this is "the woman caught in adultery." Those aren't in the original text, of course. They're just sort of how this passage is described. I don't think it is a story about a woman caught in adultery. I think it's actually a story about men trying to pin guilt on a woman who was caught in adultery, right? The story really isn't about the woman. I mean, she doesn't figure in the story that much. It's really about something else. And it's interesting that it gets called the woman caught in adultery. Perhaps that's almost missing the point of this story. Perhaps. It's a story that actually is a little controversial, because in the earliest manuscripts, so the very early Greek manuscripts of the Bible, that we have none of the original manuscripts. I mean, we have some tiny scraps of some very early ones, but we don't really have. We just have copies, right? So in the earliest copies, this story was not included. There's some evidence to suggest that it might have originally been included in Luke's gospel. I was reading from John's gospel, but there's some evidence of that. But certainly in John's gospel, and now in Luke it's not included, and in John's gospel, the early manuscripts, it's not there. So some people would say, well, it probably shouldn't be in the Bible. I mean, if you read it in your English translation, there'll be a little note there. Either the whole passage is in italics, or there's just a little footnote saying, the early manuscripts don't include this. Well, what can we say about that? Well, some people, as I mentioned, would say, it's not a genuine story, or it's not a story that was originally in the canon of Scripture. You could also look at it another way. It's clearly a story that's been handed down through generations. Okay, it's probably an oral tradition. And you could look at it this way, that it's such a compelling story. It's such a Jesus-like story. There's something so genuine and true about it that they had to include it. because it resonates with the life of Christ, right? There's nothing about this story that sort of jumps out as being, oh, that doesn't sound like Jesus. It really sounds like Jesus, okay? So I think we can totally trust this story, and there's perhaps some reasons to actually pay more attention to it, because it kind of fought its way into the scriptures, and it kind of stands out in that for that reason. We'd noticed that if you a little bit in the text there says that they were trying to trap Jesus, right? They were trying to trap Jesus. Well, we know that the Pharisees, from other things we've read in the Gospels, were trying to trick Jesus. And just the chapter before, I think we've got a little verse from the chapter before, in chapter 7. So finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees and asked them, who asked them, why didn't you bring him in? No one ever. So let me give you context of this verse. So they're trying to trap Jesus, right? They're sending people out to try and trick him, to try and get him, and they've sent these temple guards out to get him, and they're asking, why didn't you bring him in? But they reply by saying, no one ever spoke the way this man does, the guards replied. In other words, the people they're sending out to get Jesus are themselves kind of really impressed with Jesus and being persuaded by him, because, man, have you heard him talk? He's amazing. This guy's incredible. So all these attempts to try and sideline Jesus, to trick him and to capture him, are not working. And he's got a following. Jesus is actually in Jerusalem. Now, in John's Gospel, Jesus goes to Jerusalem for most of the big feasts. It's interesting, actually, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it seems like Jesus only goes to Jerusalem once, and that's at Passover time when he dies. But in John's Gospel, he goes up several times for feasts, and this is the Feast of Tabernacles, right? So it's a time of the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jesus has gone to Jerusalem like a good religious person, and he's in the temple. He's teaching in the temple. And we just saw there in the passage in the story that we read that he goes back to the temple. He's in the temple courts, so sort of the general area of the temple. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles was a really important time in the Hebrew calendar. And the positioning of this story, again, let's think about this, that this story kind of fought its way into Scripture, and it's been placed right in a chronology of the Feast of Tabernacles, where just before this story, Jesus says some interesting things about himself, and likewise, right after this story, he said some interesting things. Now let's look at those, because I think they're significant to the story. This is before the story. On the last and greatest day of the festival, that's the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Okay, so by this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. Okay, so Jesus is talking about streams of living water, and that's a metaphor for the openness to God, right? Connection to God, the life of God flowing through him, and he's saying, hey, you can have that too. This life that I've got, you can have it too. The analogy of water is very interesting, because in the Feast of Tabernacles, they've got to the point where there would have been all these ceremonious pourings of water. And Jesus is saying, I'm that water. I'm the real thing. I have God. I'm full of God, and you can be full of God too. You can imagine that really offending religious people, but for people who are thirsty for God and thirsty for the truth, who maybe don't necessarily get religion or don't feel that religious, that's life-giving. That's a life-giving statement. But he's saying it in the context of a religious festival where it would have made a lot of sense. All right? Right after the story we just read about Jesus, still in chapter 8, it says this: when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." At the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, they would extinguish lanterns. That had a very symbolic meaning. Jesus, in that context, is saying, "I'm the light of the world. You don't need to walk in darkness." Again, the positioning of these statements is not random. He's saying it in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles, where it really meant something to them. Okay? So he's saying, "I'm the water of life, and I am the light of the world." Jesus is saying and living out this connection, this openness to God. Jesus is saying, God is free, accessible to everybody. God is love. I have this life. It's like water that can satisfy and quench thirst and give life. I have this life. It's like light that can guide you and enlighten you and change your consciousness. And in the middle of all these statements, in the middle of this teaching, comes this story that we just read. This story, and it begs the question, I think, in what way are you the water of life? In what way are you the light of the world? I mean, what do we see in this story that shows us that Jesus is living the divine life, that Jesus is full of God, and that we might possibly be able to live like that too? What's going on in this story? Okay, so the positioning of the story, I think, is really important. Now let's get into the story itself. It's a story, as I mentioned, about a woman caught in adultery, except it's not really. It's more about men, and it's more about, I think, injustice. When I've read the story for a long time, but when I first used to read the story, I used to think of it as, wow, Jesus is a genius. How clever of Jesus. And I imagine that when Jesus is writing on the floor, it says that he stoops and writes on the floor, and then he says something, and then he writes on the floor some more. That I thought maybe Jesus is sort of like biding time. He's kind of like, oh God, what do I do now? I'm in a bit of a fix here. And then he gets a moment of enlightenment, and because he's the Son of God, and so it's something like bzz, a great thought comes into his head. And it's like, yes, okay, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. There you go, got it. Checkmate. And they're all like, oh, darn it, he's got us, and they walk off, right? But I think that sounds more like magic to me, and I don't think that's what's going on here. There's something else going on here. The story is full of injustice. Full of injustice. Let me give you sort of 3 ways in which these people, these men who are accusing this woman, 3 ways in which they are breaking the law. They're dragging this woman, presumably out of bed. It says Jesus goes to the temple courts at dawn. So this is early in the morning. They've caught this woman. They've dragged her to Jesus. Feels like a setup, right? I mean, it feels like premeditated, feels like a setup. And they throw her down in front of Jesus. And they say, right, we're going to trick him. And the trick, of course, is that they're saying, our law says she should be stoned because she's committed adultery. And I think actually we have a couple of scriptures here about the law. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. Okay, that's in Leviticus. In case we didn't quite get it, in Deuteronomy it says, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. Okay, so we're talking about very ancient law codes that, let's face it, are somewhat barbaric, to put it mildly. I don't think for 1 minute that Jesus had any intention that you should stone people, right? And that he was ever going to make a decision in this situation for that woman to be stoned. I don't think Jesus is saying, it's okay to stone her if none of you have sin or anything like that. Okay, let's just get that part straight for now, and we'll have to have a conversation about stoning and the ancient laws another time. But let's just say, what do you notice about that law that's not being complied with in this situation? Right. There's no man, right, being tried here. He's got off scot-free, maybe paid off, maybe he was in on the plan to, let's create a scenario that we can capture somebody and, because we can use women, right? I mean, because women don't have the same social status as men. We can control women, so we could drag this woman along, pay off the guy, perhaps, who knows? But anyway, whatever's happened, he apparently has got off scot-free, and so this woman has been dragged in. Right, so there's injustice there. Even if you live by the letter of the law, which they are claiming, there's injustice here. Let's think about this for a moment too. The trick here, part of the trick, is that they are putting Jesus in a dilemma, because they're asking him the question, should we stone her? based on that law. Now, we've already seen that the law is beginning to unravel a bit in this context. But if Jesus complies with the law and says, well, yes, the law is right, therefore she should be stoned, he's actually then going against Rome, because Rome did not let local people execute or carry out capital punishment on their people. They had to do it, right? You remember in the Easter story, Caiaphas hands Jesus over to the Roman authorities because they were going to perform the execution. The Romans didn't let people that they were subjugating carry out law in that kind of way. So if Jesus says, yes, stone her, he's going against Rome. So he will be in trouble with Rome. If he says, no, don't stone her, then he's apparently going against the Hebrew law, and that would raise a serious question for him. Well, how can he possibly be the Messiah if he doesn't comply with the Hebrew law, if he goes against the Hebrew religion? So they think they've got him, because they've got him in a situation where whatever way he goes, he's going to be in trouble, and it's either going to continue to build a case against him, or it might even actually result in his arrest. He could be accused of sedition by the Roman authorities and dealt with accordingly, right? So potentially he's in big trouble here. And it's all around this issue of the law. But as we've seen, this law is not being carried out justly. Okay, it's being carried out unjustly because there are not two people here. Secondly, there had to be, and we're not going to look into any more of the ancient law scriptures about this, but there had to be eyewitnesses. You couldn't just randomly put a woman there and say, or a man there and say, hey, he did this, that, and the other. You had to have eyewitnesses. There are no apparent eyewitnesses here, right? Interestingly also, that technically in this whole stone throwing horrendous business, it would be the eyewitnesses that would be the first to carry out the punishment, right? Horrible to think about, but that's not being complied with. Okay, so these law-abiding citizens, these religious law-abiding people, are actually not complying with the law. They're breaking the law. Thirdly, and there's other ways in which there's injustice in the story, but let me just give you one more. Third one is, this is not the correct way with dealing with this offense. What would happen, this is just based on the Hebrew culture, the Hebrew history, what would happen in a situation like this is that both parties would be brought before the high priest. And there was this kind of ceremony that the high priest would go through where he was always a male, the high priest. He would write on the floor of the temple, in the sand, in the dust of the floor of the temple, the law that's been broken and the names of the people breaking that law. Now you can see here there's perhaps some connection to why Jesus is writing on the floor, because Jesus is pointing out to them, I think, the injustice of this situation. This is wrong. You're not doing this right. You guys are missing the point. So perhaps when Jesus is in that moment of pressure and conflict where he knows he's being attacked, he knows his head's on the chopping block, so to speak. He starts writing on the floor to remind them that he knows the law, that he is from the Hebrew tradition like they are, that he's a rabbi too, if you like. And he's saying, you've got it all wrong. You're going about this completely wrong. And he pushes it back on them as the apparent sinless ones, the self-righteous ones, the ones that are pointing the finger. He pushes it back on them. It's kind of like their own law begins to condemn them because they've not complied with the law. They've broken the law. And we see that pan out by them walking away. Jesus kind of turns it around, right? Now, we could think maybe that was some instant revelation and that was like some, like a bolt from God into Jesus's brain and this great, but I think it's flowing out of Jesus's heritage. It's flowing out of Jesus's habit. It's flowing out of Jesus's understanding of his religious practice in a healthy kind of way, rather than a religious practice that is all about rules and regulations. Jesus' practice of his religion is coming out of an intimate connection to God, an intimate connection to love, rather than a connection to judgment, a connection to law code, right? Which is what their religious connection is. So he's kind of turning it around and pushing it back on them. Now this writing on the sand, though, there's another, I think, interesting implication to this writing on the floor. It doesn't say it's sand, but the dust. He's writing in the dust, right? And it's a connection to a verse in Jeremiah. Let's look at that. Jeremiah 17. Jeremiah was one of the ancient Hebrew prophets. And in Jeremiah 17 it says this, Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Reminds us of a verse earlier, right? Heal me, Lord, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are the one I praise. Okay, so this 13 and 14, particularly verse 13 in Jeremiah, is really significant. It's a verse that everybody in that circle and that gathering around Jesus, all the religious people, they would have been very familiar with this verse. And there's a reason for that. It's because this verse was the verse that the high priest would chant on the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was the day where the sins of the whole nation were forgiven. It's another Hebrew festival, actually quite close to the Feast of Tabernacles. It wasn't coincident with this story, or this time of the story, but on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take these baths, these sort of baptismal baths or mikvahs, and in coming out of the bath, would recite this verse which is a verse really about forgiveness, about being saved, about, the literal translation of it, in fact, when it says you are the hope of Israel, the literal translation is like you are the mikvah, you are the cleansing of Israel. So this verse about cleansing and forgiveness, and the fact that there's also this sort of implication of that, we can also not have cleansing and forgiveness. We can turn away from God, and turning away from God is like having our name written in the dust. And you think about your name written in the dust it's temporary. It can be blown away because this turning away from God is turning away from the spring of life, the spring of living water. We suddenly start again realizing there's all these implications to some of the things that are happening right now in this story. Jesus, in perhaps writing on the floor, is reminding them not only of the injustice of the situation and the way they're breaking the law, but he's reminding them of this verse that they will all be very familiar with, and the fact that there is love and forgiveness. There's a spring of living water, and remember, he's talked about that already on this trip to the temple. Where he's talked about him being come to me because I'm the spring of living water. He's reminding them that that's what God's like. God is loving and forgiving. He's also reminding them that you can turn away. You can reject God. It's possible to do that. And his writing on the floor is perhaps him saying, challenging them, that you may be religious, but you've rejected God. You've rejected the spring of living water. He's by implication, I think, saying you've rejected me, and I'm full of God. So you don't recognize God when you see God. And again, can you imagine how offensive at one level that's going to be to religious people? But he's pushing the envelope here. So it's not just an indictment of the injustice, it's also a challenge to them about what is religion, what is spirituality, what does connection to God even mean? It's a connection to a spring of living water, it's a connection to life, to forgiveness, to being saved, to being healed, according to those Jeremiah verses. Not condemnation, not who do we get to stone next, not self-righteousness and all that seems to religion seems to end up becoming. So there's a huge challenge here, huge challenge. And I think that challenge comes back to us, right? There's a huge challenge that comes back to us. And let's just think about this for a moment. We'll in a second, we'll move on to communion. But I just want us to reflect for a moment on this challenge for ourselves, because there's something really important here that's going on. One is, I think Jesus is saying, have life, have the real thing, be connected to God, experience the life of God. And he obviously gives that to this woman by saying, I don't condemn you. Go, leave your life of sin. In other words, live a good life, live real life. I mean, think of all the circumstances that have pushed this woman into the relationship that she's just been dragged out of. You don't get the impression that, oh, that's a really good thing. That's a really healthy thing. That's a disaster, right? And Jesus is saying, it doesn't have to be like that. You can have life. You can have real life, real connection to God, the life of God. He's saying it also to the religious people. He's actually, I think, he's challenging, but saying, it doesn't have to be like this. You don't have to adopt this kind of religion. He's saying, have springs of living water, have the light of the world, but they walk away, right? They walk away. He's saying to us, I think, as readers, you can have this life. We can have this life. We can either settle for religion and certain religious practices and put all our emphasis on that, or we can let our barriers down, open our hearts, and engage with the living God, engage with the real thing. And that's what our theme is about, right? Again, I was saying today, we're talking more about why rather than how, but we're going to get into a lot of how. How do we do that? Okay? How do we experience that kind of thing? That's the journey that we're on. That's this process of discipleship that we're in. But I think there's also something else here that's really challenging, and that is the way Jesus manifests and demonstrates and lives out this life of openness to God. Because Jesus is behaving in this situation in a way that's very different to the way I behave in similar situations. I mean, I've got to confess, I've never had anybody dragged in front of me quite like this. I've sometimes felt dragged in front of people. Fortunately, nowhere near as humiliatingly public as this, but we've probably all, experienced some of that exposure, right? Or a feeling of being exposed, and we're just, oh, it's so awful. Well, in a way, Jesus is being exposed, right? Jesus is under the spotlight. The spotlight, in one sense, is on the woman, but really the spotlight is on Jesus. All the pressure is on Jesus. This is conflict. This is a high-pressure situation. And it's a high-pressure situation for at least two reasons for Jesus. One is, this is a personal attack. Jesus is not thinking, oh, that's a good question. That's a fair question. They're after him. He knows they're after him. This is a personal attack on Jesus. What do you do when you're attacked personally? Right? I don't write on the floor. It's fight or flight, right? I either get aggressive and I fight fire with fire, or I withdraw. I just shut down. I just get the heck out of there. We don't see Jesus doing any of that, right? Jesus remains fully engaged. Jesus doesn't flinch. Jesus doesn't. We don't get this fight back from Jesus. Been very easy to say some mean things at this point. The other reason Jesus is under pressure, the other reason there's conflict, is because I think they've really chosen the trap carefully. They've chosen somebody who's unclean, right? Sexual sin and all that kind of stuff. And they know that Jesus loves unclean people, right? He just loves unclean people. He feels very passionate about that. And he's been reaching out and crossing barriers to bring people who have been outcasts because of uncleanness, culturally and religiously, and bringing them in. So they know, hey, Jesus is going to get passionate about this. And secondly, it's a woman. And Jesus is so gracious to women because women are excluded. Women are viewed as second-class citizens. And Jesus is just, he's breaking down all those barriers left, right, and center. So by bringing a woman caught in adultery, it's kind of like pressing all Jesus' justice buttons. And Jesus could just get mad and just to respond out of passion, maybe a good thing. But, again, how often do we, when we see things that make us mad, that really matter to us, how often do we respond in a really centered, compassionate, loving way? How often do we actually respond out of our own angst and our own sense of needing to be right and our own sense of self-righteousness, right? And that's not to mean that we shouldn't get angry. And Jesus clearly gets angry in different situations. And Jesus is very emotional. Like I was saying, Jesus is not shut down, right? Jesus is not shutting down. But Jesus is really centered. Jesus is open to the presence of God. Jesus is embodying this centeredness that I think is quite astounding, given the circumstances, because he's being attacked. As I was saying, he's not shut down, though. He's very tuned in. This centeredness perhaps makes him more tuned in than ever, because let's think about what he's tuned into. He's tuned into the injustice in this situation. He gets it. He totally gets it. And he's tuned with this woman. He's not just thinking, oh, there's this poor woman. I think Jesus is tuned into the mountain of injustice that is behind her story, right? What resulted in her being here right now as this victim? There's a whole story there, right? A whole story of injustice, good decisions, bad decisions, etc., etc. Jesus is tuned into that person's story, but he's also tuned into the fact that the Pharisees are trying to trick him, right? He's not just panicking and oh my gosh and fighting back or anything like that. He's tuned into that. There's a whole story behind the Pharisees. And he's aware of that story, of why they're acting the way they are and what they're doing. And he gets right to the heart of it, right? Oh, this is about the law for you. Well, look, let me respond in this way. Okay, so Jesus is not shut down and withdrawn or anything like that. He's totally engaged. He's very discerning. He's very tuned in. But again, you know, when I'm in conflict, when I'm in situations of stress like that, do you know what I'm thinking about? And you probably are very different, but the one person I'm thinking about is me, right? I'm not thinking about their story, the person who's attacking me or the person who's accusing me, I'm not thinking about anybody. I'm just thinking about my story and how I need to get that across and how I need to defend myself and how I need, right? And I think we're all pretty much the same, right? But in this situation, there's Jesus with great poise and centeredness. And then he's able to respond, right, totally consistently with his mission of love and compassion. He's able to reach out and respond in a way that brings justice, a different kind of profound justice to this situation. And he does so without compromising his values, because he's not fighting hate with hate. He's not fighting fire with fire. He's able to bring love into this situation. It's transformative. It's different. Now, of course, I think those people went away and hated him all the more, to the point where they eventually managed to trump up enough accusations that they can get him killed. So I'm not sure that how transformative it was necessarily for everybody, but it was certainly transformative for that woman. And this is the transformative kind of life that Jesus is offering when he says, I'm the living water and I'm the light of the world. It's not just, oh, the living water and the light of the world, how wonderful. Let's meditate on that. It's right in the here and now. We need that light. We need that living water when we're in the difficult situations of everyday life. And we know that Jesus, we don't have time to look at the scriptures now, but Jesus separated himself off and he went away to pray. We know that Jesus was traditional. He had this religious practice, okay, which he's not, all these stories we read about Jesus kind of challenging the religious status quo are not Jesus saying that the Jewish religion is terrible. It's Jesus saying it wasn't meant to be like this. He's kind of renewing and reforming and he's always actually quoting the prophets and saying, do you remember it wasn't meant to be like this? Remember what they said? And he's constantly adjusting and saying, no, this is what it could be like. So it's not that Jesus is anti-religious. He's just saying, don't base your life on these laws. Base your life on love. Base your life on this connection to God. Be open to God. Cultivate openness to God. I think Jesus would be all over this strategic theme, right? Because that's how we have life. That's how we get to live out the kind of life that Jesus was talking about. Right? It begins to flow such that in this situation under intense, incredible pressure, Jesus is able to respond the way he does. It's not magic, right? It's not, oh, well, he was the Son of God. He got this really amazing idea, and you know, it was like, as I was saying earlier, like a game of chess, and he outwitted them and did a checkmate on the Pharisees. This is just Jesus living out his life. And I feel I'd love to be able to live like that. I'd love to be able to live like that. And some of that is selfish, because life would just be so much better, right? I mean, it would be so much better for me if I could live like that, rather than just losing it all over the place and being all insecure and fighting this and fighting that. And you know the way we live, whether it's at work or at home or whatever it is. We're just sort of like this all the time. It would be so much better to live this kind of life that Jesus is talking about. Plus, unselfishly, I think it'll be so much better for all the people who know me and are around me, and right? We would just make life so much better for everybody else if we lived more like this, because we'd just stop being such a pain in the neck all the time. I would, if I could live like that. So, we talked last week about how we can project onto other people, into relationships, all our own insecurities, all our own needs, and set all these expectations for everybody else to satisfy our needs and make us feel secure and make us feel this, that, and the other, make us feel loved and appreciated and all the things that we long for. But really, that doesn't come from there. It comes from here. It comes from within us. And Jesus is not the slightest bit dependent on any of these people to validate his identity, to validate who he is, to validate his security or anything like that. He's operating out of a center from which, actually, ironically, he's not independent, but rather even more loving. He's able to love truly because he's not worried about what they're going to think of him. He's not worried about how they're going to respond to him. He's able to truly love. And I think he even loves those Pharisees, because he's not responding hatefully to them. He's just reminding them, but they walk away. And that happened numerous times with many people in Jesus' life. They would walk away. They would just, they couldn't handle it. They couldn't take it. So as we come to communion this morning, we have this opportunity to kind of recenter ourselves, right? We do this every week here. We take bread and wine. It's actually gluten-free crackers and grape juice because of our modern sensibilities, right? So, but it represents, like it did in Jesus' day, the life of God. Okay, and we talk about different ways the bread, what that can mean, what it symbolizes, what the wine symbolizes. Maybe not get too hung up on the symbols right now, but let's just think about this. We have a chance right now to recalibrate, to recenter. We have opportunities in every moment to recenter. And some of us have spiritual practices and prayer practices and different ways, different worship practices that help us do that, right? And it's like the investment we make in those moments, those intentional moments, builds up a sense of God's presence, an openness to God's presence. It kind of energizes us so that when push comes to shove in a situation like the one Jesus is in, or one that's probably way milder, we are more able to draw on that presence than we would be if we hadn't been kind of training and practicing at it in other situations. So a big part of this, I think, and our journey with this theme is working out the ways in which we can just get into rhythm in our life, practices in our life that make this life more real, that we practice this connection so that we have it when we need it, right? Not just when we need it, but certainly when we need it. Now, there's probably all kinds of things we could be doing that we don't know about. So let's not worry about those for now. That's all the future, right? That's something that's a journey for us. And that's an exciting journey. Let's at least anticipate it and think, oh, that could be really cool. There could be stuff that could really help me here. There's probably all sorts of stuff that, we should be doing, but that we don't, right? That we know about, maybe even stuff that has worked for us. practices that actually that was helpful when I did that, when I prayed that way, or when I took that time on a regular basis each day to center myself, etc. Okay, we probably all have some of those. So let's just focus on those for a moment. And our experience with that may have been variable, but let's just take this moment as we come to one sort of practice. That's what communion is. We do it every week. One habit. Let's take this moment to reflect on our own habits. Where do we need to recalibrate? Where do we need to recenter ourselves? How can we get back to being centered around this living water, this light of the world, such that in moments throughout the day when we are under stress, we would experience light and would experience refreshing water, not the kind of angst-filled fear or anger or defensiveness that I think we so readily experience. What do we need to do? So that's going to be personal for each of us, right? That's not something for any one of us to impose on somebody else. But let's think about it like this. Rather than it being I have to do this. What if it was, I get to do this. I get to experience God. I get to practice presence with God. I get to have this kind of life. Let's just pray for a moment and return, take this moment to return to God. Lord, we open our hearts to you. Lord, we want to be your people. We want to belong. We want this kind of life that you're talking about. We want to be givers of this kind of life. Lord, as we've been hearing about throughout this series, throughout this planning process, even as we've been hearing about around our finances, Lord, we want to be owners. We want to take ownership and responsibility for something really precious, and that is this life that you've given us and that you want us to share with the world and to share with one another. Lord, we need your life. We don't need more religion. We need your life. We need the real thing. So come to us now. Come to us in communion as we feast and eat on your life, figuratively speaking. We want to take you in. We want to take that life in. Lord, we know there are things that we can do and that perhaps we have done, and perhaps things that we are doing that help us experience more of your life. Lord, would you bring those things to mind? Would you help us with those? Come, Holy Spirit. May your life flow into us, and may it flow through us into the world. Let this moment of communion be an example of that. We ask that in your name. Amen. Okay, so please come forward, take the bread and the wine. You can serve yourselves at the sides or in the middle here. We'll also have people serving at the doorways if you want to just line up there. We have people who would love to pray with you in the back. You can make financial offerings. The towels at the back and the side are great places to do that. And you can write out prayers. We have a little station on both sides towards the back where you can write a prayer if you like. Let's take this moment to kind of recenter ourselves, not just for now, but perhaps even looking ahead to this week and beyond. Please come take communion.